Well, I was only 9 years old. I was coming to a place that had what they called bush. A distorted idea of what bush was until I got here. But really it was just a long, boring voyage, really, because it takes about 6 weeks to get here from England.
What ship did you come on?
Rangitata, her maiden voyage. It was the same boat that took me back to England, actually, in 1940.
So you arrived in what city?
Oh, Auckland, here. We stayed at some boarding house. I don't know really where we stayed, but it was somewhere. And then we eventually got on a ship called the Clansman, which has of course sunk since then, where we went to Russell. Then we went by launch from Russell to Kerikeri, and then we were at a sort of a hostel there for a couple of weeks until we moved into what we used to call the Bell Tent, which is just a tent, a rather large tent, where we lived for about 6 months near the creek. And my mother and father, who had really never experienced that sort of existence, we had to do the washing in the creek and collect water from it. And we found out how difficult it was to carry a preserving pan full of water. Not easy. An ordinary bucket would do it much better. But it was quite an experience for what was then a 10-year-old. And we went to the local school, which was a sole charge school. And I had to walk about perhaps 3 or 4 miles to get to school every morning and back. There was only 27 children, I think it was, at the school then. And the teacher came by horseback of his own horse. And occasionally we met on the way to school and he hoisted me up on the back of the horse. But it was quite an experience, that. And one of my best friends was a Maori called Benny Kingi, who protected me from the predation of bullies. He was a difficult chap to play rugby with because everybody was taught rugby there. And I do remember one incident where I was the only one within him and the goal line, and I thought, well, I just have to tackle him. The trouble was he jumped over me.
Tell me, what secondary school you went to?
Waitaki Boys High School, Nomaru, when I was 13. And I was there until the war, really. They granted me a short service commission, at least the Air Force did, but they cancelled all short service commissions and war was declared, which meant that I was sort of left in limbo at school. So I confronted the headmaster and demanded that I be expelled immediately, or at least allow me to leave immediately. And of course, it took 3 days to get home to Kerikeri in those days. And I called in to see a chap called Isaac, who I can't remember his rank, the Air Marshal or something, who was a friend of somebody I knew in Kerikeri, to try and persuade him to get me into the Air Force, at least learn how to fly, or even although they'd cancelled my short service commission. So they did that, fortunately, and I learned to fly tiger moths and wildebeests. And fairy gordons. And then by that time we were considered sufficient to get our wings, and they proceeded to send us to England by the Rangitata. We all had our wings. There was only 13 in our contingent.
Well, if you want to wear a smile and be so happy all the while, just listen and you'll never go wrong.
We got trained on fairy battles, which was an unlikely machine to fly in, really. It was built as a dive bomber, but I don't think they knew much about dive bombing when they built it, because it was a very overweight machine. Normally they have constant speed props before they had jet engines, but this only had two things, coarse or fine, and you took off on fine. When you had got up to sufficient speed, you could go to coarse, and sometimes if you did it before you should, you eventually hit the ground because you didn't maintain your speed. But there weren't many accidents like that.
Did you always want to fly? Was that
Oh yeah, well, I didn't necessarily want to go to war, I just wanted to fly, which is what they let me do, even although I wasn't a terribly good pilot.
What makes a good pilot?
I don't know what a really good pilot is, really. Just somebody who flies safely, I suppose. Of course, there's definitely two sorts of pilots. There's fighter pilots and bomber pilots. And bomber pilots they've got to negotiate things in relation to a crew, which means you've got about 5 or 6 people who rely on your competence. For a fighter pilot, they don't need to worry about that because there isn't anybody else but themselves to worry about. Of course, everybody wanted to be a Spitfire pilot, or they didn't have Lancasters in those days. They had Beauforts and Blenheims and Wimpeys and the DC-3. They were all sort of pre-war machines. They were all had cruising speeds of about 125, 130, 135 miles an hour. So they didn't really scoot very high. I suppose the epitome of the bomber would have been the Lancaster because it was very successful. It always struck me as odd that the Americans were so keen to do day flying rather than night flying. Because I did all my flying at night, it's quite nice to be able to think, well, they can't see you, although they probably could with their radar and things. But that's a sort of mental protection. There were so many American machines operating in the daytime, in formation too, which was a thing we hardly ever did. We certainly didn't do it on operation. One was sorry for them in a way, because they were a target that was sort of waiting to be hit in a way. When they briefed us to go on an operation, each aircraft decided its own navigator what time to get there, approximately, and what time to bomb, and what angle to come into the target. And it wasn't laid down as a formation thing, where each one was individually navigated. And most of the people in night bombing used to wait for an aircraft to get grouped by searchlights, and then would make its run then, when everybody was looking at the other aircraft. Didn't sound morally right, but we waited for somebody else to get into trouble before he bombed. So, and we did it individually. But our height restriction was as high as you could go. I mean, you couldn't go much higher than about 19,000 feet in a Wellington. And there were 2 Wellingtons. There was some with Merlin engines and some with Pegasus engines. Pegasus ones went quite as fast as the others. And most of my flying, or the second half of my flying, was done when I went to 99 Squadron on 1C Wellingtons, which were Pegasus Wellingtons, which in tropical climates where we were sent, they found it difficulty to climb on one engine, whereas you could do it with Merlins. But of course you had Merlins had problems in the east because of overheating, so there was a compromise in a way. Well, I was at school when war broke out. The rector used to have not a parade, a sort of meeting every morning. Everybody went into the hall in Waitaki, and he would give the current situation in the world. And we knew there was something going to come up because Germany was getting very belligerent with its neighbours and had sort of overtaken the Ruhr and started to dig at Poland and made all sorts of treaties with Russia and that sort of thing. So we knew something was going to happen, but we didn't know what. And of course, as schoolboys, which we were, you didn't realise the significance of what war was, but you soon got to learn about it once you got there. We went to an operational training unit on ferry battles. A ferry battle, how can I describe it? It was rather too heavy for the engine. It flew at about 180 miles an hour from memory, and was not an easy aircraft to fly. But of course, you had, when you're sitting in the cockpit, and there's quite a lot of aircraft in front of you, which encompass the engine, you felt sort of safe. You weren't necessarily, but it was a very strong aircraft. And in one episode there, they gave me a sort of contra-rotating propeller thing which they stuck out the side of the cockpit, so that when you made a dive, you could turn it on and it made a loud sort of Stuka-like noise as you went down. They sent me up to test it when I got to a squadron of battles. And the trouble is that I climbed up to about 18,000 or 19,000, and when I put my nose down, a fog had come over the whole of the land, you see. Well, we turned this thing on and went up and did it again, but by the time I'd finished my peregrinations around the sky, I didn't know where the aerodrome was. I could only had vertical vision, not sideways. But I found it and went downwind, as it were, turned around to make my landing, but unfortunately the ground was like this, and I crashed into the side of a hill, you see. And fortunately for me, they had the terrain there. Every 30 yards or so, they had posts put up to stop gliders landing from Germany, because the fear of invasion was quite strong in those days. And I managed to get between two poles so that they took the ends of my wings off, slowed me down, and the aircraft's prop came off. And when we shuddered to a stop on the hillside, we were all right, but the battle was over for the battle, shall we say. Not long after that, 142 Squadron, which I was posted to from the operational training unit, changed over to Wellingtons, Mark II Wellingtons with a Berlin engine. And of course none of us had flown twin engine before, and they converted on the squadron. Well, when I say none, there were one or two chaps who'd had a bit of twin experience. And so I really learnt to fly Wellingtons with people who were only just being introduced to twin engine machines, which was fine. Well, I did about 10 or 15 ops from that squad, and then got appendicitis. They sent me to a hospital, and while I was there, they transferred me to another squadron, so, which had 1Cs, which are Pegasus engines. When the war broke out, the Wellington was the top bombing machine. I can't think of another aircraft that was flying at the time, except the Whitley, which was a bit slower and a bit more ponderous, but it had a bigger range, but it couldn't carry as much. But the Wellington was a fairly easy aircraft to fly. It didn't have any real vices, except on takeoff, where if you didn't go hard rudder, you couldn't keep straight, but you soon learned that one. The operational training unit where I went to after I had appendicitis, I was posted as an instructor of all things, with my experience was practically nil I went to this place and I had to take up two chaps to okay them for night flying, and we took off from an aircraft at the end of the runway to somebody else who was signing off. And he said, "Oh, she's flying a bit one wing low, you see." I said, "Okay," so up we went, and we had a purple, which wasn't a full alert, but they put all the lights out. And so we had to stay in the air for perhaps half an hour while they get over the purple. And at the time I'd said, "Oh, well, fly with the one wing low, we'll do something about it." So I told the chap to go back and pull up balance cock and and turn on the, shut off one wing and we'll use it all from the other. Unfortunately, in those days we didn't have communication with people who were wandering around the aircraft the way you have now. It was tubes, and I couldn't get in touch with him once he'd sort of gone back to do this, and my engines stopped. Actually, what had happened was he'd turned off the balance cock and found that it was already off in the other, so he turned the other one off. But I didn't know he was doing this, so I had to make a forced landing in the middle of the night, which was not an easy thing to do. Anyway, I pancaked the thing into a paddock, which I couldn't actually see, and nobody was injured really, except one of the chaps hadn't hung on tightly enough and got a slightly knocked over back, but he could walk, and the aircraft didn't burn. So that was it. I was told that I'd made an error of judgment. The error of judgment I made was in sending a chap back when I couldn't have communication with him when he was doing what I told him.
Tell us about flying at night. What was that like?
Well, you just kept your head down in the cockpit, really. I found it fairly easy, really, but I had good navigators. I'd get the navigator to always set the compass, not me, so that all I had to do was to fly straight and level. Or over Europe, you never flew straight from A to B. You might go that way for a little bit and then say, oh no, I'll go that way for a little bit. The poor navigator, of course, has to sort out your evasive action. But if you didn't do that, they'd be able to follow you rather more clearly with their noise-seeking things. And of course, if you get half a dozen or so searchlights on you, it's very difficult to get away from them. You might get away from one or two of them, but there's always a bunch of them on you, and you can't bomb while you've got searchlights on you because you can't see the ground. So, and there were a lot of searchlights around. When I left that squadron and we went to India, the amount of defences had doubled, I suppose, from when I started. And there were two sort of waves of attack that you had to go over to get to normal targets in the rural or something like that. So you had to get as high as possible, as quick as possible after takeoff, which meant that you were all flying at about 18,000 feet, because nobody could get higher than about 18,000 feet with a bomb load. You were on your own. You found your way to the target on your own. The only thing you had was, well, you had the normal navigational things was Texel always was broadcasting, and that used to give you a directional thing, and also, of course, the star navigation. That's about it, really. You could see railway lines in the ground, and rivers, but you know, you didn't, and you knew where echo runs because they were always shooting at you. You could smell the cordite always, because there was always puffs of cordite all over the place, and you could hear an attack shell going off up to, I suppose, 100 or 200 yards away from you. You'd hear the crack, and you'd sort of got a slight shake, but we were used to that. Well, I was used to it as you can be. Nothing much you can do about it, and that was it.
Was it scary?
Well, I don't know. It's difficult to come to a conclusion of that as being scary. I've been scared once or twice, but for odd reasons. For instance, in Burma, when I went to made a bombing run on a place, I thought, well, it might be a good idea if one of their aircraft was flying, because there was one doing circuits and landings, a Japanese one, and as I got closer to there, I thought, well, now what's going to happen? I thought, well, no, I shouldn't attack him. I'm a bomber pilot, not a fighter pilot. And he was still sort of flying around. And I was uncertain rather than scared. And I think that's what you get. I don't think you get sort of scared out of your wits. you get so uncertain about what to do, and so you sort of lose your concentration because of that. I only saw one fighter the whole of the time over my operations over Germany, where it was reported from our rear gunner. He told me it was an aircraft out to the right, and I had a look, and when I went to look, the searchlights sort of flicked over him, and I could see it was a Messerschmitt or something like that. And the first thing they tell you in the books is when you see a fighter, turn immediately towards it. Don't try to go away from it, because it increases the speed of your crossing. So I did that, and I never saw him again, and that was the only one I ever saw, really.
Did you get hit by the ACAC at all?
Oh, well, I had one ACAC shell when my navigator was in the bombing bay, going to drop the bombs. One ACAC shell went clean through his seat and through the top of the aircraft without exploding. When he came back to his seat, he complained bitterly about having a thing looking like a lavatory. So I asked him if he'd shot himself, but he didn't appreciate that.
Better that than actually it blowing up.
Well, if the thing had blown up, I don't know what would have. Well, the aircraft must disintegrate, really, in a way, because the navigator's seat and contraptions are right in the middle of the aircraft. So it's a most coincidental thing to happen. I never heard of that happening before, and I had to believe it when I saw it. We were lucky in the Wellington also to have 2 movable turrets for the gunners, who had 4 machine guns in each turret, and each machine gun was 1,200 rounds a minute, and there was 2 turrets, so there's a lot of firepower there, which we didn't really use in operations, but it was comforting to know it was there.
When you were flying the aircraft at night, were you actually hand flying all the time? Did you have any sort of autopilot?
Oh, well, no. When you'd taken off, you got into George as quickly as possible, because George gave you the optimum steady climbing speed and attitude. Whereas if you do it with your hands, you're guessing all the time. Well, you're not guessing, but you can maintain the speed by either with the throttles, which you don't like to touch once you've got them set. We used George quite a bit on the way home too, but of course once you got over enemy territory, you never really flew straight and level. If you could help it, you'd be changing course every minute or so, and height and speed and that sort of thing, to inhibit what the searchlights, which you had to go through, or the lines of echo. Well, George was very good, especially in India, where we had to spend a long time going to an advanced landing base, bombing up and refueling, and then going away at the night and doing our run. And after we'd had our bombing run, we'd go all home to base. That was a long way, and some of our things would take perhaps 2 or 3 hours to get to the advanced landing base, like Agatala or Feni or something. And then you'd go on your trip and come back, and you'd probably have about 7 or 8 hours coming from the target to home. And there was hardly any ACAC or anything over Burma, so you used George a hell of a lot more.
When you were on bombing raids and you were dropping bombs, did you ever give any thought to where they were landing? Or I suppose when you're flying at night, you're not seeing too much, are you?
Well, if you're talking about the morality of blowing people up, the idea, shall we say, might cross our mind without making any effect. Because I personally, I don't know about other people, I was just interested in flying. The morality of what we were doing was a price that I had to pay in order to be able to fly. And I didn't really think too much about the morality of dropping bombs, because they, according to the briefings that we had, in nearly every case there was something like marshalling yards or construction factories or railway junctions or bridges, very occasionally. I don't know how you'd bomb those anyway. So that the military objective was determined before we took off. And you didn't think of the people that might be using that, you were thinking of the military objective. But we also had what they euphemistically called SEMO and MOPAR. In other words, if you didn't get to the target for some reason or other, and you had to turn back and come home, you had any self-evident military objective or any military objective previously attacked, which meant you could drop your bombs on anything so long as you were convinced that we'd done it before, or it might be possibly a useful thing to do. So you didn't come home with any bombs if you could help it, or if you did, you dropped them in the wash. You didn't land with your bombs. At least I don't remember anybody ever landing with a bomb. You got rid of them. There was an accident in Burma, which happened to one unfortunate chap. He pressed the titters as it were on the bombs, and one bomb was hung up. You could tell by his thing, and so we assumed afterwards that what had happened was that the wires which they attached to the bomb to winch them up into the bomb bay machine, one of them hadn't undone, and the bomb was hanging underneath the aircraft with its propeller in the front, probably armed it, and when he landed, the bomb hit the ground before he did. He didn't know it was there because he could close the bomb bays. He never saw the bomb. It was night time, and it blew his aircraft up. I don't remember doing other than I'm told to do. As a pilot, they gave me the aircraft and the crew and things, and we train ourselves. We're ready to go and drop bombs on where they say we ought to drop